All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is obviously a special topic, an area that, obviously most of you know is my area of expertise in conflict resolution and international relations. Obviously, this is a near and dear topic. Julianne's work in Amnesty International the last couple of years probably had an impact on her selecting this topic. I was going to say that for her mom's coming in late. We have
No, we got
okay. Okay, she gets to. Anyways, it's been a long. Sometimes I'm now reflecting on this as the year winds down. For a lot of these seniors, I've had them for 4 years, 4 long years. In this case, of course, academic excellence on the tennis court, great student leader in this community. I really miss her next year. Let's give it up for Julianne.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julianne Taco, and I'm so honored to present before you today my honors senior thesis, Life After Civil War, Trauma and Societal Reconstruction in Africa. The goal of my project was firstly to analyze why there are so many civil wars in Africa, secondly, what role the women and children play in the conflict, and lastly, how these war-torn African societies can recover from sometimes decades of conflict in which neighbors killed neighbors, friends turned to enemies, and children were forced to destroy their childhood homes. Within these areas, PTSD is faced on immense levels, as entire communities are attempting to heal from their collective trauma. This is a timely issue, seeing that many of these conflicts are still ongoing, and the emotional wounds left untreated can prevent socioeconomic development and fuel generational cycles of violence driven by revenge. I wanted to begin by first recognizing some of the most instrumental resources in the making of this project, beginning with The Challenge for Africa by Wangari Maathai, The Fate of Africa by Marcia Meredith, Children at War by P.W. Singer, and Child Soldiers in Africa by Asinda Hamon. The first two were crucial in the development of the history section, whereas the latter list was crucial in developing the other two chapters. Between the years 1946 and 1991, there was a 12-fold increase in the number of civil wars across the world. Even today, civil war continues to be the main form of global armed conflict. Africa is at the heart of this violence due to its long history of Western oppression and failed leadership. Since gaining independence, 22 of Africa's 54 countries have experienced civil wars, and the continent currently accounts for almost 90% of all conflict-related deaths in the world. In doing my research, this led me to the question, why Africa? I found that both the cause and the prevalence of civil wars within Africa can be attributed to its long history of mass trauma, colonialism, and failed leadership. The Berlin Colonial Conference of 1884 solidified the divide between Africa's peoples. The new national boundaries and artificial state systems created by these powers broke apart these traditional societies, while other territories were unified despite socio-political differences and historical tensions. An estimated 190 culture groups were divided by the new boundaries. Furthermore, the scramble for Africa resulted in the division of roughly 10,000 different African groups into only 41 European colonies. This would lead to the intensification of identity politics regarding religion and ethnicity, prompting many future uprisings and civil wars. When independence finally came, the colonial powers had left in haste. Although many African nations had an abundance of natural resources, they were stripped of the economic benefits by the colonial powers who had destroyed their systems and economies. Although free, they were left vulnerable to poverty and famine. Consequently, minority groups became increasingly marginalized, and tensions continued to grow due to factors like relative deprivation and a lack of representation. Locals lacked ways to express these grievances, because without effective systems of justice, the power of the gun became the new form of administrating justice. A dictatorial regime was simultaneously cultivated, imposed, and in time increasingly tolerated. In a desperate attempt to climb out of this poverty, much of the population fell trapped to easy money, corruption, and violence. Therefore, appetite of aggression became a part of everyday violence within Africa. Slowly, all over the continent, state sectors began to crumble, and a new trend of authoritarian rule began to sweep its way throughout Africa. It was during this period of decolonization during the Cold War that the eruption of conflict began in the late 1990s. For the United States, the fear of the spread of communism was enough for them to support political leaders such as Samuel Doe of Liberia, who were kleptocratic leaders. Instead of stabilizing these newly independent nations, the Western powers were set on a seemingly irreversible path of self-destruction. The ruling elites took advantage of the oil and external aid from these foreign nations, ultimately feeding the monster of African politics, corrupt, lawless, personal rule. Many nations' resources were drained into the repressive militaries in order to silence the voices of dissenters. This violence was then exacerbated by the surplus of military weaponry after the peace dividends of the Cold War. Millions of weapons became available on the world market for extremely cheap prices. For example, in Uganda and Sudan, an AK-47 could be purchased for the cost of a chicken. In northern Kenya, it could be bought for the price of a goat. This is equivalent to about $5 US. This development of weaponry has contributed to the militarization of these societies and the growth in the use of child soldiers due to the lightweight of these new weapons. Not only were the rights of the people violated as governments plundered national treasuries and resources, the locals were also forced into civil and interstate wars in order to protect the rights to basic survival, as well as to reorder Africa's state systems. The semi-democratic regimes of Africa are often the targets of these insurgencies. Although many civil wars in Africa have been fought over ethnic and religious disputes, ultimately a large proportion of civil wars in Africa have stemmed from the desire to reorder its state systems so that development can finally ensue. Conflict continues in Africa in part because of the creation of warlord economic systems that are dependent on this violence, like those led by President Charles Taylor in Nigeria and Jonas Savimbi in Angola. Furthermore, the environmental and infrastructural damages of war have created an additional strain on the economy, limiting the available livable territories. The cycle of war never ends, because the more limited the land and resources are, the greater the likelihood of conflict. In other words, the violent conflict exacerbates the very conditions that gave rise to it in the first place, creating a classic conflict trap from which escape is extraordinarily difficult. In researching these conflicts, it became impossible to ignore the glaring issue of child soldiers, which then led me to ask, why children? While it's counterintuitive, the condition from which Africa has been forced to build its foundations has played a major role in the generational disconnect, instability, and stagnated development that continues to fuel the recruitment of child soldiers. Rapid population growth within Africa's developing nations, coupled with the lack of resources and education, has caused high rates of malnutrition, as well as the fragmentation of the continent's social structures. The children are undereducated, malnourished, and marginalized. Desperation has drawn them to illegal economic activity, organized crime, and armed conflicts. Furthermore, due to the widespread nature of HIV and AIDS, the demographics of this region have been altered. It was estimated that by 2010, AIDS had caused the deaths of one or both parents for over 43 million children. In large part due to the spread of AIDS, roughly half the population in Africa is under the age of 18. Left orphans, many are forced to take charge of their own survival. Without anything left to lose by participating in the war, the typical bounds of fear are broken. Children are prompted to seek control over the violence and the misery that has dominated their lives. They're handed a weapon and told to kill before they even grasp the concept of morality or truly understand the consequences of death. Groups will specifically target these children due to their susceptibility to psychological manipulation and the cheap price for which they can be exploited. Around the world, these new soldiers are injected with fear-inhibiting drugs and forced to commit unspeakable atrocities. Under the careful watch of their oppressors, they're manipulated into destroying any connection to their home, whether that means torching their villages or killing their parents and their siblings. Once indoctrinated into this life of the soldier, many will serve as sex slaves or endure consistent abuse from their leaders. Changes in the dynamic of warfare has caused the problem of child soldiers to cross gender boundaries. Due to the prevalence of sexual violence and rape, these girls are more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, and PTSD. This form of abuse is used as a means of domination and compliance. One girl tells of her experience, saying, "I was raped the moment that they captured me at 12 years old, and I bled and bled. I could not walk. The man who raped me later carried me on his back." The presence of child soldiers in combat has heightened the levels of sexual violence typical of contemporary conflicts. Although this violent abuse of women has been prevalent throughout history, it is no longer a byproduct of the conflict, but rather a strategic weapon used to indoctrinate. The result is a drastic increase in the violence against women. For example, during the Civil War in Nigeria, indiscriminate gang rapes reached record levels, and mothers were raped in full view of their children before being bludgeoned to death, and machete-wielding soldiers had split open the bellies of pregnant women at roadblocks to, quote, find hidden rebels. According to statistics provided by the United Nations, within the last decade, over 3/4 of armed conflict have involved child soldiers. Over 25 million children have been displaced by the war, 10 million have experienced psychological trauma, 6 million were disabled or severely injured, and 1 million became orphans. Having grown up among this conflict and violence, the children's attitudes, relationships, moral values, and societal perceptions are developed around the world that envelops them. Every key aspect of their growth is hindered by this factor. Due to their young age and extreme vulnerability, as much as 97% of child soldiers were reported to suffer from PTSD. These symptoms can vary from child to child and take on both physical and mental forms, though the most common of which include depression, nightmares, anxiety, and memory and cognition issues. As represented by this former child soldier aged 14, the trauma these children face hinders their ability to engage in healthy daily interactions. He says that most times I dream, I have a gun, I'm killing, cutting, amputating. I feel afraid because perhaps that these things will happen to me again. Sometimes I cry. When I see a woman, I'm afraid of her. I've been bad with women, and now I fear that if I go near one, she'll hit me. Perhaps she will kill me. The extreme nature of the effects of the on child soldiers is captured by one Ugandan aid worker who claims, "Some of the children sit rocking. It's like they're not there, they're a shell. Some children sit and look at running water and just see blood." Such early exposure to violence can lead to distorted worldview, defined by hypervigilance to threat and subjugation of intent and the willingness to endorse violence. The lesson learned here is that violence begets violence, and those who experience extreme levels of trauma and brutality are likely to become entrapped into the cycle of violence and contribute to the aggression, crime, and abuse that actively perpetuate it. These are the severe implications of failing to address mental health and psychosocial support in areas that are torn apart by civil war. It is not until the trauma and grievances of these victims are effectively addressed that these cycles of violence can finally be broken and peace can begin to be restored. Breaking out of this escape cycle marks the beginning of a new, complex process of societal healing. Through demobilization, reintegration, and social reconstruction, child combatants are given a chance to begin again. They are faced with new promises of peace, stability, and an education. Contrary to popular belief, this is not a lost generation. The wounds of war can heal because it is the very qualities that help these children survive these harrowing experiences that may also enable them to catalyze change within their shattered homelands. Thus, we must remember to not forget the children. They're an integral part of any solution to rebuilding peace within war-torn countries. Because of this, the implementation of the necessary deprogramming and reintegration programs is very crucial. Turning a soldier back into a civilian or a child cannot be done within one step. This is a lengthy and dynamic process that requires sustained commitment. If implemented incorrectly, the mediators may lose the trust of the people, and they will return to violence, making it more difficult to create change in the future. This thesis covers adjustments that can be made to disarmament, demobilization, rehabilitation, and reintegration processes, but for the sake of time, some of the most important lessons can be learned by just looking at the case of Sierra Leone. The reconciliation process after the civil war in Sierra Leone is one of the most notorious examples of the consequences of an inadequate funding, a lack of attention to the issue of child soldiers, and the failure to include the voices of civil society and all of the victims. Within this country, the limited relief efforts were not enough to care for the vast number of ex-combatants. The number of soldiers overwhelmed their systems, and the time allotted to each soldier within this process was only 1 week. Furthermore, within the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program implemented in 2003, only 7,000 of 48,000 child soldiers were demobilized. Of the $34 million invested by the United Nations into this process, only $965,000 of this was directed towards child soldiers. This is less than 3% of the funds. Most children in these areas end up back in the streets, turning to crime as a way to sustain their livelihoods, and eventually they're re-recruited. As Neil Boothby, a child psychologist and former senior coordinator of the United Nations, states, I think it's safe to say that unless we're able to break this cycle of violence, unless we're able to focus on this teenage population specifically, it will be the teenager who picks up the gun and starts this next cycle. Because of these factors, the initial peace processes failed. The settlement and ceasefires were short-lived, and ex-combatants joined the armed conflicts and fighting resumed. It took years for the United Nations to successfully reinstate a period of peace. This stemmed from the establishment of the 1999 Lomé Accords, which made history for being the first treaty to recognize the existence of child soldiers and outlined specific goals for the rehabilitation and reintegration processes. Getting parties to acknowledge the use of child soldiers has been one of the most difficult challenges of the reconciliation process. The problem for women and girl soldiers is even greater, seeing that many groups attempt to keep the girl combatants even after the conflict has ended. The number of returns of women and girl combatants often do not match the number of girl abductees. For example, when a reported 591 abducted children were released from the camps, only 10 of these were girls. Furthermore, because women in these societies are not given a voice within official government institutions, these grievances are not heard. And even after they make it out of the camps, many of their voices still remain invisible. The very programs that are designed to help them with their mental and physical needs fail to involve their voice in the conceptualization and implementation. In order to truly implement an effective, inclusive humanitarian response, gender dimensions must be taken into account. Considering that women could often be the greatest victims of these conflicts, having lost their husbands, children, land, and dignity, it is crucial that they are supported in their journey to rebuild their lives and their communities. These women often take active roles in grassroots and community level reconciliation programs despite a lack of support from the governments. For example, within Mali, the women took part in creating a national coalition campaigning against illicit arms. They were not only able to organize a regional meeting, but also sign a declaration to hold an arms moratorium. These women have also utilized various networks, including church groups and women's associations, to raise public awareness of the small arms issue. Furthermore, they've been instrumental in providing each other, though especially these young girls, with guidance and emotional support. This shows that women, if given the power to transition from victim and perpetrator to mediator, they can make substantial change. Frustrations with the failures of the process, however, still led to high levels of re-enlisting. Within Sierra Leone, hundreds of child soldiers fled from the camps and were back on the streets with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. One former soldier passionately argued that we risked our lives to hand in our weapons, and yet we are incapable of feeding our families and cannot even pay the rent. The solution is for these people to give us our weapons back. As a result, it is extremely important to work to grow the implementation of democratic institutions and the economic capabilities within these countries in order to combat the evils of militarism. Furthermore, researchers and officials must learn to listen and seek out the expert opinions of the young but politically informed fighters who are not yet old enough to vote, but they can truly win their loyalty and their support. Lastly, in terms of trauma-oriented interventions, the most significant problems exist because cultural and regional variations are overlooked or downplayed in importance. Thus, universalized trauma interventions, though they have good intentions, are ineffective and harmful, especially within these African nations. In some situations, trying to force certain Western-oriented trauma interventions can cause more harm than good. For example, within the sub-Saharan Africa, it is discouraged to talk about the situation out of fear of unwanted spirits returning, due to the importance of spiritual cleansing within their culture. Because of this, even well-intentioned practitioners who are unaware of local cultural beliefs and practices may put people at risk of significant stress by encouraging emotional expression. Ultimately, a successful peacekeeping operation that focuses on reconciliation requires adequate funding, resources, and personnel, as well as has the intention of long-term commitment, ensures that all voices are heard, and respects cultural methods of healing. Exclusion and ignorance are often the causes of civil conflict. Thus, inclusiveness and understanding can be the key to peace. As emphasized within this thesis, the healing, reintegration, and reconciliation processes after civil wars are incredibly complex and require a vast understanding of the nation's societal grievances and internal dynamics. Peace is delicate, and the processes of healing and social rebuilding must be led with empathy and carefully monitored for warning signs of conflict. The goal should be to take a pluralistic approach to healing and build partnerships with local and independent groups. Multifaceted engagement, driven by the local community and supported by international institutions, allows for the integration of civil society as an essential institution within the peace-building process, the mediation of the underlying societal causes of conflict engagement, and the disengagement and reconciliation of violent actors. Furthermore, by including all voices, especially the women and the children, with the project planning and implementation, the reconciliation processes will gain the needed support to create a sustainable peace. Loyalty and trust will be fostered between the locals and the international organizations, and the obtained results will demonstrate the value of the reconciliation processes as opposed to armed responses to violence. Moving forward, societal healing needs to be a greater priority if the continuation of civil wars and genocide are to be prevented. Ultimately, peace cannot be built without first addressing the underlying causes of conflict and truly healing the wounds of war.
Why did you select the continent of Africa? Did you ever consider a cross-regional perspective? And looking back on it, if it was August, whenever we started through August 11th, would you still stick with the African case studies, or would you do cross-regional?
We did talk about Asia a little bit in the beginning of this process, but ultimately Africa just has so many civil wars and it's such a prominent issue within this continent that it was hard to ignore, especially because there were so many primary narratives that could be found about this, which just made it an interesting topic to do.
What about the relapse factor? After someone has gone through this rehabilitation process and such, do you see any data that suggested that there was a high level of relapse factor?
For sure, there was a very high level of, especially within these last few decades, but we're starting to make a little bit of a transition now because they're focusing more on the healing processes. But before, when they were only focusing on the reconstruction, they were rebuilding these institutions. But because they didn't work on societal healing, the tensions were still there, and the children were likely to go back to conflict. And because of, like I said earlier, the availability of weapons, that makes it incredibly difficult as well, because most soldiers do not just have one weapon, they have multiple, and they're given multiple by these groups. And so when they do trade in their weapons for these processes to get the societal healing and the reintegration help, they have to trade in a weapon, but normally they still have many more to go back to in case the conflict does begin again. And many of them don't trust that the peace is going to last. So that's why they're hesitant to continue to work with these international organizations, because they think that eventually the conflict is going to restart.
My turn?
Yes, yes.
I have a question, and I'm not, so correct me if I got the data wrong. You said something about, I think, 1 million children ended up in orphanages. Was that correct?
Yes.
What happens after they end up in an orphanage? Did your research take you through any of that?
A lot of the time they cannot go back to any society because of the tensions. So a lot of the international organizations will hold them temporarily and help them reintegrate slowly. So that way the tensions, either if it's like ethnic or religious or political, it'll help ease the way in.
Back into their existing culture.
Yeah, right. And because of like the role of international actors, this makes it hard for the communities to be accepting completely. But it does help that a lot of the times they'll make the child soldiers play a part in the rebuilding process. So there's a photo earlier on the right. They actually will make the child soldiers play a role in rebuilding their infrastructure. And so that helps the communities be more willing to accept it.
And do you see is there any hope for any of these children to be adopted out of an orphanage? Is that seen at all, or are they, mostly older children who are beyond what we would consider a prime age for adoption? I mean,
Look, it's difficult because these conflicts are often decades long. So a lot of the time the children who were child soldiers are already adults and they never got the help that they needed. And now they're already integrated into society, but they never fully get the help. So they don't have the development.
Excellent job.
Thank you so much.
I was curious to know, what the organizations and the foundations that you've come across, is there any particular ones that are really making a difference, or is there just a numerous amount of organizations that you came across, and there's a handful that are really making progress in the areas? I know when I went to visit with an organization, that was just one, but I know there's many. Is there any in particular that you came across that are really helping out?
Right. Well, of course, there's groups like the United Nations that are providing a lot of money and infrastructure help. But I think that the most impactful ones have been actually the local organizations. I mentioned earlier the group of women, and those have been incredibly impactful despite not getting as much help from the government. If I had more time to write my thesis, I would have really loved to include a case study about Liberia, because within Liberia, there's a group of women peace builders that have made substantial change. And I talked a little bit about the group in Mali, but I would have definitely liked to add that in.
Phenomenal job, excellent presentation. As far as the international community, has there been a push to hold arms trade more accountable, or to hold the corruption from the side of the politicians more accountable? How do you kind of deal with it from that international policy level?
There have been attempts on the international level, but it's hard if there's no democratic institutions in place within the actual country itself to make sure that there is not a lot of corruption, especially within the authoritarian rules. That's incredibly difficult to make sure that the arms are not getting into the wrong hands. And there is a huge influx of weaponry, also, which makes that process even more difficult.
You mentioned that you had a lot of firsthand accounts that you were able to rely upon. I know that in a lot of post-conflict areas, art is really important. Was there any piece that really stood out to you? Were you able to explore that at all?
I didn't really get to explore that much. I wish I did, but I know that I did find some research on things like art therapy, and that's been really substantial in these nations because it helps get children I think it was called normalization techniques, and that was one of the tactics they used so that the children can feel like kids again.
Excellent job.
All right. You said 22 out of 54 African countries have had civil wars in the post-Cold War period or post-World War II period. Does it matter whether a country has adopted democratic institutions or had elections as to whether they end up in a civil war situation, or is it totally not relevant?
It does make it less likely because more people are getting a opportunity to express their grievances. However, there's the interconnected nature of African conflicts makes that more difficult because when conflict is in one area, it's more likely to continue to spread. This was the case in Rwanda, and then it just continued to spread, and those tactics that Rwandans were using were spreading out to all these other areas. So it's a little bit of both.
Real easy question, this last one will be, what was the worst case study as far as just doing the research and how, difficult this can be when you're talking about excessive violence and such? What was the most horrific case?
I would probably say either Liberia or Sierra Leone. Within Liberia, it was different because normally child soldiers are a last resort whenever they're running low on soldiers. But in Liberia, Charles Taylor actually had used them initially. Like that was his tactic to use these child soldiers. So the amount of abuse within that country was a lot higher than these other nations. But also, that's hard because also even Rwanda, like the tactics used in Rwanda were a lot more brutal because they didn't use traditional weaponry. Like they used like the most brutal tactics. And also like the human rights violations, I think in Rwanda were like surmounted among the others.
I want to open up to the esteemed audience here, a lot of experts.
Caroline.
So I know in our international class we talked about Nigeria and about the women empowerment movement there and how women lock the political officials in a courtroom. Like you can't come out until you figure out your lives. I know that's like a really general discussion about it, but do you think that Liberia, the women there, provided a great example of how to mitigate conflict and come out of conflict in these civil wars?
For sure, I think it definitely gave women an opportunity to demonstrate the power of their voice. Like we said in Mali, like they've started to take up some of the responsibilities as well, and it's showing that their voices matter, and the government officials are starting to take notice of that.
So I know in like Ethiopia, there's like mass starvation going there because of like the Tigray issue, and the government isn't being held accountable for blocking that food that's going into that Tigray region. So how do you think that governments can be held more accountable, especially when it comes to mass starvation and issues just like food shortage?
That's incredibly difficult, especially because they are not particularly fond of international intervention, so that makes it hard to get the resources in. But through things like NGOs, which are a little bit more impartial, it makes it makes those resources more available. And if they are distributed through local organizations from international groups, that also can help with the resources issue.
Well, I have two questions. One, you talked shortly about the United Nations, but have you seen any efforts to try and delegate a lot of these tasks to like the African Union to like, attempt to have more of that like cultural awareness? And my second question was, have you seen like conflicts spill over and the problems of like IEPs further destabilize other nations and like further exacerbating like regional conflict as a whole and leading to more conflict, more violence?
For sure. I'll answer that second part first. That was actually in my paper, but I didn't have time to put it in the presentation. I mentioned briefly to topics like the Rwanda issue, and a lot of those refugees who fled from that nation, they brought their brutal tactics with them to other countries, and so when those conflicts erupted, those conflicts in turn also became human rights violations breeding grounds. And then to your first question was, sorry, what was it?
Has the UN tried to delegate some of its like reconstruction efforts to the African Union to an attempt to like, have that cultural like cognizance and awareness?
I didn't do any research directly on the United Nations, but I did do my foreign service last year on something similar. So the U.S. Foreign Service has actually been doing that and been working with local groups within Nigeria. and they particularly had utilized the religious leaders within their nation to build reconciliation. So they are beginning to recognize the power of local peace builders. Harrison?
Is there anything or idea or concept that you talked about in your writing, but you didn't have time to include in your presentation that you wish you could have?
There was a lot I had to take out to fit this 20-minute presentation, but I think for sure, I would say there's a lot of solutions that I had to leave out because for the sake of time, but I did get to focus on Sierra Leone, so that was nice. But a lot of these therapies, like they'll utilize traditional methods of healing, so particularly the spiritual healing process was very interesting to read about. Different communities obviously have different practices, but in Angola, they have a really cool tradition of fire lighting. And so whenever they have a community fire, and then after conflicts, they'll extinguish it and start a new one. Each person within the village will take their own house fire and light it with a community fire. So it shows that like they're starting again as a community, so that the wounds were healed. Layla.
This is kind of going off of the answer you just gave, but I was wondering, like, how much did you find in your research that, like, culture and, I guess, cultural pride kind of not necessarily got in the way of these, like, healing processes, but, like, maybe prolonged is a better word?
It definitely did. That's a great word choice, actually. Especially, you'll see this in South Africa as well, or even just any country that attempts to use these truth processes, because that relies on, I guess, personal willingness to express their story. And obviously, if it's your own personal story, there's going to be some conflict between conflict of interest. And so you do see that, but eventually just by talking about the issue rather than holding it in within or internalizing it, it does help the process a little bit.
Great job. Let's go back to slide one. Get a photo, individual negative.
Anybody's phones that I say
Oh, sure. Still in contact.
Where are you at? Let's get a solo one for.
Her first. Oh, preview the song. Yeah.
I mean, no, I'm waiting for that.
Okay.
Okay. So we're in the center.
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm actually not on committee, I'm just.
Yay. Great job.
Maybe I want to get a picture of this.
Yes. Oh.
That was the hours and hours of your, oh my goodness. So in your house. Maybe start thinking about after graduation. Has she chosen a school?
She's kind of.
She hasn't made a final decision.
Yeah.
Tyler,
want some of that.
2 down, 1 to go now for y'all. Jamie and I I mean, all these
Thank you guys. That's what I love for you guys. Jamie is. She was actually trying. We're having. Why are y'all throwing rocks at us? All right, we're getting ready for our next. We're gonna have a little hidden gathering all day on the 11th. Look at Landon, there was stuff working. Look at that. That's why she did that. Look at that. And then it's a good thing you're there. It was a good thing you're there. Put this back here, okay? All right, we got about 2 minutes here until we get started. No one's right now. I will know it already. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. And actually, you know, what? Which one do you have? Oh. Yeah, for my associate. So. Alright, let's take a shower, watch the.
I am.
Well, that's the best.
She has like a pizza. I just didn't want to take her. So now you're good. This is my family. All right. Give me the.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to, I believe this is number 14, I believe. You were lucky 13. And day 7 of our senior thesis defenses. They'll be running through next Tuesday. Will be our last day for defense. Come on in. It has been a pleasure to work with George the last 2 years. He was a late arrival to Team Topic, but once he drank the Kool-Aid, everything was good. The passion about this has been interesting because 2 of our projects this year have been about the urban phenomenon, which is cool. One was totally internationally based with Becca last week and George today, focusing on the United States, plight of U.S. urban areas. So without further ado, let's give it up.
Thank you, and welcome to my honors senior thesis. I'm George Cook, and I'll be presenting my thesis on the life of the American city, exploring the history, problems, and future of U.S. cities. So to begin, I'd like to go over a few important sources that I used throughout my presentation, my thesis. So first, The Walkable City by Jeff Speck, I used throughout chapter 3, especially in the walkability section in chapter 3. But also I used The Triumph of the City throughout chapters 1 and 2. And the reason why I decided to make this thesis and why I decided to do this is because I was interested in the evolution of cities, their problems, and some future ideas and stuff that we could change about American cities, for better or for worse. However, to get to there, we need to start with the creation of American cities. And these cities were created by colonial powers situated along waterways, typically on rivers, ports, and other lakes and other waterways and such. The first example is New York City. Here it's situated along the Hudson River, but its creation was similar to that of European cities. It is densely populated around its core on Manhattan Island, but also utilized the unique technique to the U.S. cities, which is gridding, where cities were situated along grids to facilitate more and faster growth. And cities kind of developed in a similar fashion until the Roaring '20s, where cities began to expand vertically because of skyscrapers, but also this saw some other growth, like culturally and economically. So, and also we saw for the first time cars and through the Model T and other stuff. But however, the Roaring '20s came to a close with the stock market crash of 1929, where millions of people, unfortunately, were sent into poverty and lost their houses and jobs. A lot of people had to move to Hoovervilles, which were shanty towns that were created in and around city cores. And these were named after Herbert Hoover, the president of the United States at the time, who was largely blamed for the Great Depression. Fortunately for the United States, World War II provided a unique opportunity to bring us out of the Great Depression. And because of a massive industrial demand, cities began to industrialize rapidly, and we were able to bring people out of the depression by employing people and other newly created jobs. Coinciding the end of World War II was the Federal Aid Highway Act, which was proposed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, creating about 48,440 miles of interstate, which he was able to sell this as essential to meet the economic needs of our growing population, our expanding economy, and our national security. However, one caveat of the Federal Aid Highway Act was that it kind of began to center us around cars. However, cities around the country were being able to be connected for the first time. In order to create these interstates were situated inside the inner parts of the cities. So on the right, you can see that it's going right next to downtown. And the way that they would incorporate these cities, or these interstates into cities, is that they had to demolish neighborhoods and demolish areas that people lived in. And typically they targeted poor and minority groups, such as like black communities in cities. And with a new emerging exodus of people leaving the city and going out into the suburbs, we were beginning to see the creation of mass-produced suburbs, such as Levittown, which in this case is Levittown, New York, created by William J. Levitt in 1929. And this was a mass-produced housing, similar to kind of like the methods that were used on the assembly line by Henry Ford, excuse me, which made housing cheap and affordable. But this housing was not for everyone, and it was coinciding with a new phenomenon called white flight, where people, white families, were beginning to leave the inner cities out into the suburbs because of fears of minorities. And the way that the country was able to facilitate this white flight and keep certain people out, or like minorities out, is through a homeowner loan corporation, where the loans were granted to people so that they could go and buy housing out inside or in the suburbs. But depending on where you lived, specifically in like cities, you would be you could either have a loan or you would be exempted from. And depending on where you were, if you were in like a red line district, you couldn't get a loan. With this new exodus of people, there was, a lot of open and empty land within the center of cities. So through a process known as urban renewal, cities were trying to, or their aim was to renovate their cities and downtowns, try to get rid of slums, try to get rid of poor quality housing that inhabited the city centers. But some of this was never, a lot of it was not so successful and ended up displacing people. This is an example from Boston and West End, which was a tight-knit Italian community, which happened to be next to the financial district in Boston. And in order to create this new real estate and these new high-rises, they had to displace this community. And Ronald Reagan, which became president in the 1980s, came at a time when cities were at their lowest point. He wanted to push smaller government because he thought that government was the source of problems for the United States. And the way that he would address these problems was through a system of privatization, tax reductions, budget cuts, and dismantling labor unions. He also promoted decreasing regulations, diverting money away from cities and into the suburbs, further creating this suburban inner city divide. So, because of those policies, we come to today, where cities are no longer situated in the urban cores that they had typically been before, but now they're sprawling out. They are no longer just one area. Like, for example, LA in Southern California is just miles and miles and miles of housing, low density housing. And one result is that cars are becoming the predominant form of transportation. And cars have a lot of caveats. They are expensive in a few ways. They are physically, environmentally, and economically expensive. Economically, because buying a car is expensive. I mean, a lot of people that can't afford a car are priced out of being a part of society. And also, buying gas and maintaining roads costs a lot of money each year. But also physically, which is a less understood problem, but because you can't house as many cars within parts of the city centers as much as other forms of transportation could bring other people in. For example, cars have the lowest types of transportation carrying capacity out of any other form of transportation. So the solution seems like we should increase public transportation. And yes, but one problem is you want to do it right. Like many things in life, there are good intentions but bad execution. For example, the Detroit People Mover was a form of transportation that was trying to be created within Detroit. However, due to budget constraints, the scope of the project had to be scaled back and resulted in the People Mover only being situated in downtown. It couldn't go out into the city because there wasn't enough money to have people come in. And this is a problem because the fundamental problem of public transportation is that you want to get people from point A to point B. And if you can't even get to people at point A, how is it supposed to be effective? How are you supposed to get them around the city? So, a lot of these problems with public transportation result in us becoming a commuter-based society. And now we live in suburbs. We live in edge cities. And edge cities are suburbs that kind of grew into their own entity, like Big Tent and Bryant is a good example. And the reason why people are moving out is because housing prices, cost of living, rents, and taxes are just so high that people cannot afford to live where they used to anymore. And one example is of Danny Finlay, who lives in Dixon, California, who drives he uses 3 types of transportation to go all the way to San Francisco from Dixon. And that's about 72 miles from his house to his occupation. But it takes about 4 hours round trip. So he sacrifices so much time in order to save money. So it becomes a cost benefit analysis. Is your time more, or is living close to it more important? Another impact of the cars is basically that cars are environmentally costly. So in order to have cars and have them be used, you need to use fossil fuels and gasoline to power cars, or the vast majority of our cars today. And these create CO2 emissions, which everyone knows is a huge contributor to climate change. So, and because of this massive amounts of vehicles in the United States, we actually see that transportation has become the largest sector, at least CO2 emitting sector, out of every sector, as you can see on this graph. And actually, the reason why power and energy sectors have been becoming less CO2 intensive is because of renewable energies and other sources of alternative energy becoming more mainstay. So you might say, wait a minute. So if gasoline is a problem, how about we start trying to transition into electric vehicles? And that's a good solution, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not a long-term solution. It's kind of more of an intermediary solution. And the reason why is because electric vehicles are still very CO2 intensive to create. You need to source the materials that are put into the vehicle. You have to have these super intensive CO2 emission processes in order to get it. But also, another underlooked problem with electric vehicles is that you can't source all the lithium in the world to create enough electric vehicles to replace former gas-powered vehicles, because there's physically not enough on the planet. Lastly, gentrification is a rising problem in the United States, and gentrification can be known as a profit-driven race and class change of historically disinvested neighborhoods. And there's 4 stages to gentrification. The first stage is where poor and disenfranchised people come out into these communities that are also poor, and they try to renovate it and upgrade it. Now, other people start taking notice, typically middle-class people, of this new investment and new revitalization of these areas. And they start moving in because they like the aesthetic or like the working class feel or whatever of the neighborhood. And the third stage is that these middle class people start taking prominent positions. They start becoming local authorities and having say in the community. And it represents changing of the guard of the community. It's no longer just the people that were disenfranchised that moved in and took over. Now it's these middle class people taking over. And then finally, wealthy people start moving in with more money, and they start pushing people out that originally lived there. There's this displacement of people that arise. But sometimes gentrification can work. It can have a positive impact, albeit without displacing people. For example, Del Mar Boulevard in St. Louis is an example of how gentrification can possibly actually help an area. Del Mar was not part of a very prosperous part of St. Louis, but through some gentrification, where people began to come in and start businesses and whatnot, the area started growing and becoming more prosperous. However, the most important part was that people are not being displaced from this area. However, the most common problem with gentrification and the most common thing with gentrification is that there is this displacement factor. And for example, in Oakland, California, where historically Black and working class neighborhood or area is being slowly pushed out by the new tech giants from San Francisco, who are trying to make real estate investments and buy out the area in order to make money. So what can be done? What can be changed? And what are some ideas that can help our cities for the future? With not short-term gains, but more long-term gains in mind. Well, one idea is that we want to encourage a walkability, which is basically the idea that in an urban environment is no longer forcing people to just drive. It's going from a car-centric idea into a more human-centric. It's basically encouraging people to walk, and walking is healthy for everyone. Everyone needs to walk, but also it decreases CO2 emissions and it decreases car volume down in urban cores. Also, coinciding with walkability, public transportation needs to be further bolstered. Now, we already have some public transportation in urban cities, but this is kind of only exclusive to really populated, dense areas. It's not ubiquitous throughout the country. So, if we want to have a more sustainable city, we need to increase public transportation. And part of this increase of public transportation is this idea of interconnectivity, where you don't only have just cars, you don't only have walking, you don't only have rail, but you have an option of all three or more. Buses, even a boat. But you're not forced to take one. You're taking whatever is most convenient to what is your situation. So if you need to go to your friend's house, which is only 2 blocks away, you can do that. But if you need to drive out of the city, you can also do that. So single-family zoning is another kind of understood or not as well-known problem, but it's a problem that is all across the United States. Basically, zoning laws throughout the United States only allow single-family detached homes to be built throughout the country. And one problem with this is that it's only low-density housing. You don't really have a more kind of clean gradient of housing and density. You're forced to have this low-dense or high-dense housing. So what a good idea to try to promote is this missing middle in between, where you're no longer just having low or high density, but you have a more kind of consistent a middle ground with throughout. Also, one way to try to at least ease the problems of unaffordable housing is introducing social housing or public housing. And in the United States, public housing is kind of stigmatized because of its association with crime and drugs and typically bad things for American families. But these places do not have to be so drab and dreary. Instead, they can be beautiful, green, clean. This is an example of social housing in Vienna, Austria. And because the state is not so interested in making a profit, we can focus on instead making life more livable and happier for people that have to live in these places. And because of that, we can focus on trying to make a more sustainable future with a more green and more human-centric approach. And thank you for coming to my Thesis Defense.
Question really relates to the ending of your project. Is there any models of public housing where it's working in America? What are we trying to do differently? It's interesting, even the terminology. We don't want to call it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting. I'm glad that you noted that. Is that I'm trying to stay away from public housing because America, there's not really that much great public housing because it's all in America. We only know it as like the projects or there's public housing. But I'm glad that you noticed my change in rhetoric, which changes it away from the public housing but the social housing. But unfortunately, in America, there's not that many great public housing initiatives that I know of, and that's because of our approach to how we did housing. So instead of having as cheap as possible, because if you look back here, a lot of these houses were quickly built in order to try to like maintain as low of a cost to build the stuff but not have as much of a long-term and more human-centric approach. Because if you look at like the one in Vienna, Austria, it's just a lot more visually appealing. Also, these housing units have like pools and stuff. They're like public amenities, and they're not so expensive.
Would you, if you're doing this project over again, would you have considered doing something like a case study approach where you'd have looked at particular cities and just ran with those particular case studies the whole year? If so, what were this particular cities that you really felt like, I wish I could have done more research and reading on this particular case?
Yeah, I think some case studies. I would keep my American scope, like specific to the United States, and I think some good cities that would be that you would want to look at are like Los Angeles. I wouldn't do New York because I think it's overdone. I would do something different like Boston. I think it kind of has the same. It's like, in my opinion, the most European city. That's kind of why I'm actually going there for all this. So it's because I like the walkability and stuff. But I think if I was to do it back again, a case study approach would be very different, but it could potentially have like a lot of good examples and provide like a good flow. So
I was curious, as you were researching this and going through the process, did you approach it with any, or did you recognize any preconceived notions you might have had, and did you discover information that then changed possibly the trajectory of your planning?
Kind of. I don't think I had too many preconceived notions because I kind of came into this project biased already about what I was interested in. I knew what I was trying to talk about, but I did kind of learn more about, like, especially I think like social housing was something that I thought was like, why don't we just do that right now? Or there's just some like ideas that I thought could be implemented more. It kind of made me a little envious of what could be and whatnot. But I wouldn't say I had preconceived notions that weren't either realistic or kind of unrealistic. It was just kind of like I had an okay understanding. Thank you.
All right, I got you. So you mentioned Del Mar as like kind of being a successful case of gentrification. Yeah. So how would you, using that as an example, like how do you prevent displacement and gentrification in other cities?
So that's a good question. The way that you kind of prevent that is by introducing like rent control and housing rate control. Basically, you have to step in and say, look, we cannot allow this rampant, like right now in the housing market across the United States, housing prices are just going up exponentially. And we don't want to have that exponential growth or that really rapid growth in housing prices because it can't keep up with everybody. And I think Del Mar specifically was more of a lucky case rather than like, yeah, exactly. Because, I mean, I don't know. I don't think St. Louis is really that known for like planning out things so well. It was just kind of luck. It was luck. But that, such is life. There's a lot of lucky things that happen.
So one of my questions that kind of falls into both the gentrification, like you talked about, setting policy for controlling rents, is also, do you feel like this type of approach, and you go into more in depth in your actual thesis, but setting state and federal kind of policies that kind of moves more towards that middle housing that you described?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you get bipartisan support with that approach?
I wish. I don't think I could. I don't think I could get either support, honestly. I don't think, because I don't think the interest of either party is really aligned with, and this is like an unfortunate reality, but I don't think either one is too interested in kind of investing in new infrastructure and stuff, like, because in my opinion, I think the Democratic Party is the one that you could probably get the most out of. I think in like specifically like certain cities and whatnot, really like urban areas, you could really garner support. But I think by and large, for like a federal policy, I think it would be really tough to kind of get that support. And because I think the interests that kind of like fund a lot of these parties are more inclined to just kind of maintain the status quo because they benefit the most from maintaining.
Last question, sorry.
please.
So this one's tied into, you mentioned like the rise of CO2 emissions being tied into the transportation industry. Did you also find that that rose with the increase of shipping that's
Yes.
happened?
Yeah.
And
I mean, sorry. Continue.
well, so really the question I was going to get to is the model you're shifting towards, would that be more beneficial towards lowering like the shipping, like the effect of the trucking industry, like the shipping industry on the emissions?
Thank you. I think, okay. So what I'm trying to go for is not necessarily trying to address as much of like the shipping and my scope is more like contained into like how we can make daily life less carbon intrusive, I guess.
Sure.
So I think that's something that I could learn more about if I went back and kind of researched this. But I think that kind of goes into a more broader understanding of kind of the impacts of climate change and how to address it.
Sure.
Because I think it's just
Outside the scope?
yeah, a little outside the scope. But I think, but it's really interesting. Yeah.
Awesome, great work, man.
George, good job.
Thank you.
Kind of a continuation off of the last question. Of course, cities are blamed for a lot of the CO2 emissions that occur, but I'd like to kind of hear why mid and high density cities have the potential to be vastly more sustainable.
Yeah, and I actually left out a little bit of something that, because I had to cut down my project, but like one thing that I learned about is that how single family detached houses are environmentally really bad because you have to individually heat each unit, and it's also kind of self-contained. So the amount of energy you have to put into heating that is a lot higher than it would be normally. But also, if you have a more, I guess, like dense kind of housing, you're no longer having to rely upon using cars and stuff, and your daily, I guess, impact upon kind of like carbon emissions is a lot lower because you either walk or you don't have to transport as much or you don't have to go as far. It's just like the distance aspect. Having kind of everybody kind of more closely situated allows for less CO2 emissions. So like if you live in a city right now, you're like New York, for example, you statistically like this is a thing I see online a lot is that people will be like, they'll post a picture of New York City and they'll be like, this is a very polluted area or like there's a lot of people living here, and they'll post like a picture of like a rural area and they're like, well clearly clearly rural area contributes less on your daily carbon emissions. But that truck, that F-150 that you haul around nothing in every day, going to and from work and whatnot, actually per person contributes a lot more to climate change.
I have one more, and then I have a lot, but I'll just do one more for now. Urban renewal in the United States presented a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And one of the facets of urban renewal was that they practiced policies of slum clearance and slum renewal. And that occurred in our own city in Little Rock. We have still to this day a lot of buildings that were set for clearance. We have just a lot of vacant parking lots and unutilized space for a place that should be high density. If you were mayor of Little Rock, what would you do to change that?
I like that question. Okay, so this is not like a solution you can have in a year or 5 years. This is like a many year kind of thing you have to address. But my goal is to kind of bring people back into the city and try to make it more accessible for people to live in it. So I want to increase like public transportation opportunities within it. But the way I would honestly do it is I would probably build housing myself in the city. If I was like the local tyrant, I would be able to do that without any problem. So like the social housing would create a lot more affordability for people to live in the city, and therefore I could kind of like force people in a weird way. But
The network dictator.
yeah, but like, and I think one thing that that has been seen in other cities. I think like Rochester, New York is an example. Also, I think New York City itself, but is that they have actually demolished the interstate that went right through the town because it does create this huge divide from in Little Rock. There's this, I don't know how much everyone goes downtown, but there's that north-south divide between, is it I-30? 630, that splits kind of the two neighborhoods. And it's really unfortunate because it was so like tight-knit before it was prosperous. It was 9th Avenue, I think it was. It was like a very prosperous black neighborhood that kind of got gutted in order to create this area. But I want to like bring the city together, instead of tearing it apart. So,
Audience?
other questions? Benjamin.
Okay, so overall, European cities are like widely considered to be more walkable and less car-reliant than U.S. cities. And like that's because like the U.S. has like the interstate that cuts off different communities and cities and like prevents walking between them, and they're so car-reliant. How does like America make its cities in the future? How does it make it more European-like?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's, once again, it's just a long-term solution. People have to start just coming back into more of the city. And the way that we would do that is we need to build, and actually it goes back to that single-family zoning, is that we need to encourage more kind of medium density housing. And this would have to be spearheaded by the local government because there's a lot of development and growth out in like West Rock, but there's not as much, at least in my observations, in like downtown. So we want to like, I guess, focus our development projects kind of more in the city. And it's just a lot of like just kind of struggling to bring people in because, it's really easy to like keep doing and maintaining the status quo, but it's not sustainable. It's in a way, it's kind of like a Ponzi scheme in a weird way, where suburbanization. Oh, hello. Anyways, where you have to buy in, or like the way that these areas are sustainable is that they keep having to have people buy into them, and it relies on exponential growth. So areas that kind of did not get to see this exponential growth keep going, like in the Rust Belt in the United States, really lost that base of people that keep it propping up. So these areas kind of went into decline. That's why like the Rust Belt is known as Rust Belt, because they couldn't. All right, Evan.
You talked significantly about the use of public transportation. So I want to know, what is your opinions on kind of the utilization of transportation services that use people's own private vehicles like Uber or Lyft, and the expansion of these, because you were talking also about CO2 emissions and how, individuals' cars, emit a lot of that CO2.
Yeah.
So what are your opinions on the expansion and use of those kinds of services?
Well, it's a little frustrating because it's like people kind of understand that you need something to get people like from, where they need to go. But it's like, it feels like it's a step in the wrong direction when instead we could be focusing on trying to like encourage more, I guess, public transportation options. But honestly, in my opinion, the biggest problem with like Uber and Lyft and whatnot is actually it's part of like the gig economy, and the reason why it's really bad for the people that have to work in it. Like Lyft and Uber don't have any protections for their drivers. You're like an independent contractor, so you have a lot less like security within the system. So it's actually very predatory for the people that operate it and like are working in it, which is also kind of another problem with this growth, is that it's very predatory. Harrison.
Joe, I thought it was really interesting. What was one thing, like your favorite thing, that you had to cut out of the presentation? You didn't have time?
Let me think. I think I tried to get all my favorite stuff in, but I had to cut at the end. There was like this section about like super blocks, which is like thank you, you remember. It was basically like creating big blocks out of already established blocks within our cities. In the example I used, because I wanted to like model some of these ideas off of existing like things, is that in Barcelona, Spain, they have these already big super block, I guess, formations that have been very successful. And what they do is they combine like in Barcelona, combine like 9 blocks into this one big block where cars are not allowed to go through it unless if you live there. So it kind of like forces a lot of traffic outside of these blocks, making them a lot more friendly to like pedestrians, a lot quieter, and just an overall more enjoyable human kind of centric experience. And also weirdly, it speeds up traffic. They're like, you're not having to wait as much because you don't turn as often because you don't have like a red light turning left every second. It kind of like triples the length in which like major turns are happening. It's interesting. Layla.
Okay, this is kind of 2 questions. When you were talking about walkable cities, a lot of times people are kind of like turned off to the idea of walking because of like a concern about time.
Yeah.
So the first question I have is like, how do you kind of confront that like, fear of time or not being able to make it to work on time or having to work, like leave so much earlier in a walkable city? And then the other question that I have is like, when talking about public transportation, how do you kind of, like, do you have any suggestions on how to go about breaking down kind of, I feel like public transportation has kind of gotten deemed as like dirty, and like if you're higher class, you're less likely to want to go into like the subway, or you're less likely to want to ride on a bus. So I guess that's my question is like, how do you
Yeah, that's good. And that's something that like I've thought about as well. But I'll go to the first point of fear of time. And one issue that a lot of like subways and or public transportation options that we have in America have is that they're not reliable. Like in Japan, for example, there was like this train that was 40 seconds late and did a public apology about being late. They had to publicly apologize for being 40 seconds late. And that's like perfectly fine for us. So you have to like have a more reliable system to have a more comfortable, to be more comfortable to rely on your public transportation. But also, yeah, a lot of people do not like walking. I mean, look at us. I don't have to say more than that. I don't like walking that much, but you know, I think it's better though. It's like a more long-term solution as well. I mean, you're less likely to die walking on the side of the street than in a car crash, or like while driving down the street. Let's put it that way. So, but also breaking down the stigma of public transportation is kind of a hard thing because breaking down, oh no, my computer died. Sorry, well, we'll just have to make do. But breaking down the stigmatization of public transportation is kind of difficult because we're already kind of having a struggle with breaking down stigmatizations with other things, right? Like if you're struggling to kind of convey to people why, I guess, gay people existing is not a problem, then how do you convince them like something so small as this? And I think the way that you would do it though is kind of exposure to like the idea of it. It's hard, but I think as well though, as the generations kind of shift, younger people, in my anecdotal evidence, are more inclined to be open to public transportation. They don't see it in the same way as other people might have in previous generations. So I think it's the timed exposure and just kind of, a lot of activism to try to promote the creation of it. So, Sid.
Okay, so in your research, did you find any obscure methods of public transportation? So I know like
yes,
Boston.
Yes, I did.
So Boston has like the city bike, And also, I guess like electric scooters, which I don't know how widespread or effective that is, but like sort of examples like that. Do you see any like obscure methods that could be widespread?
Okay, that could be widespread.
Or just
Well, I think bike sharing is a really cool like idea, but I want to say like one really weird public transportation thing I saw was like this gondola system in West Virginia or something. It was really weird because it served like a few hundred people. Like there's no one that used it, but it was there. And it was in like the middle of nowhere. It's not like a ski town or anything either. It was just kind of like connecting this hill or like two parts of the valley. It was just, I don't know, it was really bizarre. But kind of unique and solutions is I think one big problem with public transportation is, especially in the United States, how do you get people within that last mile? It's like this idea of the last mile, basically, because you have somebody that lives in one house. Let's say if you're like in the Heights and you have to walk like 10, 15 minutes to your place or the bus stop or whatever. One way that we could try to like, I guess, promote being able to get through that, like from your house to like the public transportation is by increasing like bike ridership and actually like trying to have good ways of storing bikes, because if you've ever been to like the Netherlands and like walked around, there's these huge like bike storage things. I don't know how to container unit things. They're really interesting, but their purpose is to like house bikes, and it's just kind of having something to get that last mile going. So it could be like a skateboard or something, or some sort of like other form of transportation. Typically, bikes work really well. So, but,
One more question.
One more. How much time do we have?
We're at 4:48 too.
Okay. Kelsey. Right.
So you talked about later about stigmatization of social housing. So
Yeah.
I was wondering how would you way to kind of erase that stigma? I know you mentioned terminology, switching up terminology.
Yeah, and I think we really like aesthetics in the country. I mean, if it looks kind of sad and depressing, we're going to assume it's sad and depressing. But actually, though, like making it look really presentable and kind of like changing who is necessarily for your target in a way, but it's still making it affordable. So like making it look good, like the social housing in Vienna is visually pleasing. It's very green. That's something that if you notice more, if you like traverse parts of like the poor sides of Little Rock, there's actually a lot less green space. Areas are a lot more kind of concrete and brick and whatever. But in like rich areas, if you go down like Pleasant Valley or whatever, there's so much green space. There's so much like attention to making it look really pretty and look appealing. So yeah. Agreed.
So, kind of going off of Benjamin's question, one of the reasons why also European cities are more walkable is that they were created like pre-industrialization. Have you seen in any way like countries like maybe Singapore, China, who are also post-industrial countries much like America, reconciling walkability and vehicles? And what are your thoughts on Singapore's usage of like vehicle certificates or like licenses and having like maybe price barriers that many cars only to like
That's an interesting thing to talk about. It's like they are kind of being aggressive in the way that they discourage car usage in the city. I think there's a big difference between culture in America and Singapore. Singapore is a lot more collectivist in the way that they think. So it's more of like a public good to not use your car than like my personal freedom to drive my F-150. But also, I think that this is something in Japan and also that I saw is that you had to have like a kind of, what is it? There's like a tax on it. You have to go through the police to like register your vehicle. They do this really crazy search thing that costs like $2,000 to like make sure your vehicle's up to standard or whatever. But it kind of like, it's just making owning a car a lot less appealing. Also in Stockholm, Sweden, to kind of like shift it, not only in Singapore, because I truthfully don't know that much about public transportation in Singapore. But I know in Stockholm, they actually posted like a $2 entry fee to like, it's like a toll within the main islands because Stockholm is an archipelago. And the only way you can bring your car into the islands is to pay this $2 fee. But that $2 fee was enough to like drop the ridership or the amount of cars that were in the center of the city significantly. And even like a 10% drop or like a 20% drop just frees up traffic so much because each time that like, it's an exponential traffic. But yeah, I think like I like those things, but we need to get closer to that before we start being aggressive against cars, unless if you're probably in like New York City or like San Francisco. But that's very specific. Yeah, I just never how you do it. We're gonna get a real quick. Try to get the. Yeah, I just got. That's all right. That's all right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's this is exciting.
Oh yeah, do you want all of our questions? Yeah. Any questions?
Take care, guys. Yeah, that'd be great. I'll be here. Just let me know. I'm usually here. That's perfect. So where are you going? YouTube, it's like
She'll share some of them. I frame it later.
I'm gonna say one more.
No. Love the camaraderie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good question.
Ah!
One time that I want to know.
We have light. Yeah. It'll never end. It'll never end.
But like,
wait, what?
All right.
Wonderful. Okay, friends. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1.
We'll get a solo of George real quick.
I would love to come to some kind of ransom. There's so much good stuff.
We'll have our thesis book up here. A new one.
Chris Forster.
All right.
Pleasure to meet you.
Man,
you soon.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I felt very related.
What? Okay, one of you solo, George.
Go.
That's a winner. I mean, I'll email it to you, George.
3, 1, 2, to the left. Yeah, figure out what you're doing with your name, right? Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Wait. 3, 2, 1. Would you guys like a family photo?
Want it?
Yeah.
I love to edit on your desk, and Kyle left his on the desk. and I'm gonna put him on here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll talk to
3,
you
2,
soon.
1. Aww. 3, 2, 1.
Woo!
You did that! Yeah! It's you!
What is
Okay, guys. Oh, you know that photo. I know it's gonna be like we didn't cover up, photo every night. Albert, when you drop your policy, Albert.
Zoe.